Ladies and gentlemen, it was my pleasure so far to be in the audience for the previous panels with an extremely high quality, and we will have a hard job to match that quality, but we will try because we are having a very good team. The previous panel tackled the countries that have declared their European direction within the Eastern Partnership, and it is a very natural and very creative distribution of the roles of the panel that our panel, the next one, will tackle the challenges, visions, and actual account of the state of affairs of those countries within the Eastern Partnership that have entered the Eurasian Union. And I will use the shorthand Eurasian Union. We all know what we talk about. And that, of course, has also, as actually Zsolt Németh alluded to it in his keynote speech, that category has also a subdivision, and more closely our panel will concentrate on the two countries that have entered the Eurasian Union and not necessarily on the role and vision about Azerbaijan, the country which in the above-mentioned characterization was somewhere in between these two approaches. We also have the benefit of two non-interested observers, at least certainly not coming from countries which would be interested in this question. And I will introduce them when their part is coming in order to save time. We would like to get answers to questions like what kind of cooperation are possible or may be needed between these two unions. What kind of European Union policies are recommended by the speakers? Naturally, in order to match the quality of the previous panel, we need to know from both Armenia and Belarus what is their vision about the future. Is the Eurasian Union a danger for the Eastern Partnership project in any of its shape or any following any of the visions, the possible visions of the future of European Union Eastern Partnership? And finally, we would be very interested to know a question everybody is asking, including probably people in Moscow. What is the Eurasian Union actually? Is it and there is this old secular joke, Hungarian joke, the Székely Transylvanian Hungarians joke. When they see a camel in Transylvania, they ask, is this something or is this going somewhere? So the question is, is it Russia alone? Does it have a presence and future of its own? And whether the European Union, when the European Union is planning its way towards the Eurasian Union, does it have to deal with Russia alone or really with the Union? These are my preliminary thoughts, and I ask Lolita, the CEU, as Commissioner Pillbugs already revealed, that she studied here at Central European Union and she is chairperson of the European Affairs Committee and of the Parliament, which is the Sejma. And I will not dwell on any other achievements of her, because you can find it in the biographies. Lolita, please.
Thank you so much, Miklós. Indeed, Mr. Čigāne said that he's very happy, or that he was very happy to speak here at the CEU auditorium, given the atmosphere in the late 90s when all young people were waiting for the happy admission letters to the CEU to be able to come and study here. And I was one of those lucky young people at that time who actually got the admission letter, so I was very happy to study here at IRES. 1999-2000, as was already mentioned by our ambassador. And I really just, this is by the way of introduction to my speech, I have to say that at that time, as a young person from former communist world, my world was to a large extent black and white. And that's very natural for young people. And actually studying and spending a year here at the CEU kind of turned the colors on. And I started seeing many more colors of the world, and I've been trying to develop that trend in all my professional work after studying here, and including also chairing the European Affairs Committee. So I'll try to keep these colors on while talking about the Eurasian Economic Union project. And we'll try to give my assessment to this project, because I thought that our chair, Miklós, thank you for asking very appropriate questions that we will be trying to answer here. So first of all, I would like to share the observation that from the beginning, the whole project of customs union and general Eurasian Union or Eurasian Economic Union, no matter by which word it might be referred to, was of course at its inception the idea to create something that would be alternative to the European Union single market and to the opportunities that the European Union single market is offering, and thus to give an alternative to countries that, for instance, looking at the case of Poland, which has seen its GDP grow tremendously since it started its way towards the European Union, and since it's actually become the member of the European Union, to have it probably less attractive and to have a convincing way to argue that there is a viable alternative. However, at the point when countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova stated that their future vision is actually connected to closer integration with the European Union, this was the time when the first cracks started appearing in this grand project that was supposed to have a grandeur of a Euro-Asian space, single market, and whatnot. So basically, the situation was such that a rather firm refusal to ponder this integration from the presently association agreement countries was the first signal that when we had to start asking the very question of what is it and how is it going to progress and is it going to have any success. And of course now we know that the European Economic Union is supposed to have started operating from January 1st, 2015. And this is a good time to take a view of what is it and has it really been operational. And I will probably throw in a provocative thought. I will be happy to answer questions and hear comments from those who would not agree to that. But I would argue that it's a stillborn child from the very beginning. It has not really been born alive because of many issues, including the issue of aggression that Russia has been conducting vis-a-vis its neighbor sovereign Ukraine over the last year. Why is it? Why would I argue that it's a stillborn child? Because we see that there are actual trade wars going on between Belarus and Russia, between Kazakhstan and Russia due to the sanctions or embargo that Russia has imposed on Western imports, and there are trade disputes between those very core members that are supposed to be forming the Eurasian Economic Union. We know that Kyrgyzstan, that was supposed to be making decisions on joining on 1st of May, has stated that they would postpone their joining, so they've become more hesitant too. And a perspective that we will hear from the Armenian side is also a perspective of disappointment and now a renewed enthusiasm for closer ties with the European Union, which were disrupted by the very U-turn Mr. Sargsyan, the president of Armenia, made in 2013. So the question is, if to those who subscribe to my analysis that it's a stillborn child, should we take a delight in this humiliation of this project? Should we take a delight in the fact that actually the aspirations of Russia and its President Putin have been humbled by the process that is not really happening? And I would say that we should be very careful with our analysis, because obviously with the failure of this project, there might be more aggression, more nervousness emanating from the Russian side. And we know what consequences it might have for all of us in Europe. And it was very well analyzed by our colleague Shalgu from Ukraine in the previous panel. I would like to state another, probably a little provocative idea, that if the Eurasian Economic Union was really a genuine union of a single market of goods, services, free movement of people, and mutual cooperation in energy issues, and so on and so forth, the whole world would benefit from it. But the sad fact is that it's not, and actually the way it has been formed and the way that the countries forming this union are actually prevents it from becoming a genuine Eurasian Economic Union of characters that I mentioned. It would have a potential to have countries as equal partners in this union. It probably would have a potential to be mutually beneficial. It probably could be an engine for prosperity in the countries that would join this Eurasian Economic Union, but it won't, because the reality is very different. The reality is very different because there is obviously one very dominant country, which is Russia, which still treats its immediate neighborhood as its subjects very often, and sometimes harbors ideas of renewing the past grandeur of empire and later Soviet Union. Many of the countries, or at least Russia and Kazakhstan themselves, are very much dependent on the possibility to export their natural resources. They would be joined with countries which have fairly weak economic structures like Armenia or Kyrgyzstan, which would not have much to offer. We already heard in the previous panel that there would be no pressure to reform the markets or to curb corruption, which is of course very important for genuine union and genuine free flow of finance, people, services, goods, and so on and so forth. And the last thing, these are countries which are authoritarian. And authoritarian countries are always very careful about delegating their management, economic and political management powers to any supranational authorities. So that would be another difficulty. And of course, all of those countries have a tradition of close involvement of the state in functioning of the economy. We've seen it with trade wars, with banning selectively exports from certain countries, and so on and so forth. So since we had a very good comparison with camel in the intro, I would say that, again, maybe a little provocative comparison, but I could compare the situation with a situation where you see a madman holding a knife in their hand and asking people to come to their party. And of course, only those people who can be manipulated can and would come to the party. And what are the tools for manipulation? First of all, it's countries' dependence on energy supplies. Second of all, it's a large diaspora, our migrant community, as some countries find it in Russia, which can be pressurized, and where societies depend on remittances from their citizens who live and work in Russia, for instance. The presence of frozen conflicts that was already addressed in the first panels in our key opening speech is the presence of Russian military in some of those countries, and also internal weakness, lack of internal consolidation, internal economic weakness. And just on the final note for my remarks, I was last week in Turkmenistan, and it's a very interesting Central Asian country that is one of the more closed or most closed Central Asian countries, but that holds the fourth largest deposits of natural gas in the world. And Turkmenistan does not have any of those four ways that would make them subject to easy manipulation. That's why they've been very happy to keep their status of neutrality, and they would not ever ponder a possibility to even join such union. So these were my remarks, and I will be happy to hear comments and also, of course, disagreements to what I just stated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a really good introduction and provoked a lot of questions. I'll put them later on. Our next speaker is James. James Nixey is head of the Russia and Eurasia program of Chatham House in London, and he was gracious enough to agree to a discussion without Chatham House rules, and we are very thankful for that. Thank you. Please.
Well, thank you very much, and let me pay you a return compliment by saying how proud I am to speak here in this wonderful city, in this excellent institution, and thanks in particular to Susanna and Cecilia for amazing organisation. By background, I should say I'm something of allegedly a Russianist or a Kremlinologist by old terminology, and so a lot of my remarks will refer back to Russia, but I'll try to keep Ivana's sort of structure of three parts, talking about the Eurasian Union, a little bit about China, Chinese alternative, and of course about Russia itself. Let's start by giving Vladimir Vladimirovich some credit where it's due. He is an excellent strategist, contrary to popular belief, as you and I were saying at dinner last night, Julian. And he is not stupid. And so he understood well the need to move slowly with these newly, for him, nominally independent countries, and thus was born in 2010 sort of the Eurasian customs union, which is now morphed, if you like, into something a little more different. It was a useful economic pre-step to something a lot more encompassing, a lot more all-encompassing, which would ultimately allow Russia control over, or official control, if you like, over the geopolitical orientations of the other former Soviet states within the Union, that which is so important to the Kremlin. If you believe that the Kremlin doesn't want soil particularly, which is a contention in itself, but does just want influence, then this is the legal structure towards it. But it's even more than that, ladies and gentlemen. What it is meant to be, according to Vladimir Putin's design, is a geopolitical force, a new geopolitical force, capable of standing up to all competitors on the world stage. And Eurasianism is the ideological glue which holds that together. And Russia, of course, is the head of the Eurasian civilization. So what we're looking at is two unions here, a Western European one and an Eastern Russian-led union. And those are the terms in which Russia thinks. So let me ask, I will try and answer Miklós's questions, but I'll ask, is the Eurasian Union legitimate? I think yes, it is. If countries wish in their sovereign choice to fall into such a union, then it is entirely legitimate. And I'm sure that my two colleagues on either side, Richard and Andrei here, will talk about the ways in which their countries have gone into the union, which I would regard as illegitimate. But in principle, of course, there is no problem at all with. There should be no problem at all with any kind of Eurasian Union, be it economic or political, and I'll come back to that in a second. However, does it make sense from an economic point of view is a question well worth asking. And the answer has to be no, because it is doing its neighbours untold economic harm. If you go to Kazakhstan, for example, I won't mention Armenia and Belarus here, but if you go to Kazakhstan, everybody in Kazakhstan will tell you how it is detrimental to the Kazakh economy, which in some ways is more sophisticated than the Russian economy in banking terms, legal terms, accounting terms. And the Kazakhs have basically chose to go in to the Eurasian Union because they felt it was not worth not going in for the, what Russia may do in return. Of course, Kazakhstan is conceivably in Russia's crosshairs in a post-Nazarbayev situation. But so I would argue that Russia is simply not attractive enough to its neighbours, either economically or politically, for this to be a going and valid concern, for the Union to be to have legs, to have a future. It's had predictably limited success so far, attracting members amongst a wary group, as I say, to put it mildly. And its membership has so far been limited to those countries over whom Russia has the greatest hold. And again, I look at my two co-speakers on either end, sort of wantingly or knowingly. So Russia does have, Russia is becoming less and less attractive, and it's also incurring greater costs as a result of this less attraction. Russia has what's popularly known in IR terms as escalation dominance or fear dominance. It fights for hearts and minds, but in a negative kind of way, and as a result, these countries gravitate away from Russia slowly. So it seems inconceivable to me that the Eurasian Economic Union, can be attractive, no matter who's in it, bearing in mind the politics of domination that Russia pushes. Now, it is also true that the Eurasian Economic Union divides minds within the EU. Some in the EU, and Miklós hinted at this, talk about an integration of the two processes. There's a famous article by Ivan Krastyev and Mark Leonard in the FT and various other places, which talked about how as it was an economic-led organization, and this is a way forward to improving relations with Russia. I find this very hard to see. Given the EU's diversity, given the lack of consensus, I don't see how a new organization funded on or founded on strictly non-normative terms and with a great deal of coercion can possibly have a proper integration process with a 60-year-old organization with laws and regulations and processes and values which are completely different to those which the Eurasian Union pushes, and this was mentioned by Dimitra earlier. Now, with regards to the Union itself, again, the reason I don't see it as being valid, the Eurasian Union, then it wouldn't involve, for example, unlike the EU, labour movement from low-wage economies to high-wage economies. In fact, it will probably result in labour shortages. In fact, there's not even going to be much movement of capital either. So who is getting the economic benefits from Eurasian Economic Union is not at all clear. But politically, and this is my real point, politically there is a lot more logic to this from a point of view of Vladimir Putin, of course. When Putin in 2005, and I know much is made of this, and it's a bit of a cliche, but the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union, he wasn't just talking to older generations in Russia. And I think the rest of us have to take this a lot more seriously. So all I would say in regards to the Eurasian Union is I am a skeptic, to put it mildly. Lots of people could benefit from improved economic links in this region, but I don't see these improvements as coming from the Eurasian Economic Union, and I think we need to recognize its considerable limits. Very briefly on China, and I mention this for a reason. In China, it has an alternative economic integration idea, the new Silk Road project, and we mustn't forget about this. Unlike the Eurasian Union, is based upon low tariffs and external trade. It would probably bring greater benefits to some of the Eurasian Economic Union countries, such as Kazakhstan, than the Eurasian Union itself. The Chinese are putting serious money behind it, unlike the Russians, and they've offered Tajikistan $6 billion, for example, for infrastructure, Chinese-built infrastructure, I admit. And I think that these countries of Central Asia do have a very valid alternative option in China. But by raising barriers against China, which is what the Eurasian Customs Union will do, the Eurasian Economic Union will do, then this will have a negative effect on Central Asian economies itself, because as you know, China is the leading investor in Central Asia these days. And unless Russia can fill this gap, it's just not going to be beneficial for them. Now, finally, just to talk on Russia very briefly, because it's been mentioned. I mean, it was asked earlier in the opening remarks, how do we have a modus vivendi with Russia? And the short answer is that we don't. We can't. It's not possible. Look, I don't know how to put this, but Mr. Ligas asked. He said the EAP is not confrontational. That's absolutely right. It's not. But Russia believes that it is. What is Russia saying? Russia is saying that NATO and the EU cannot protect you. Russia is saying if you pursue an independent course, then Russia will wreck it, and it has the ability to do so, and the West will have to pay. So I suppose what I'm trying to say in conclusion is that it's a mistake to try to persuade Russia of our good intentions. They don't trust us. They believe that we are hegemonic. And there's no argument you can produce which will change that. And that has serious implications for the future. I mean, we can talk about that because it's incredibly important. But I can't emphasize enough that you can't negotiate with Russia. What is negotiation? It's a means to an end, like war. And the two sides do want different things, I'm sorry to say, and they do have different values, I'm sorry to say. So saying that we can negotiate is madness, because one side believes that 2 + 2 = 4, and the other side believes 2 + 2 = 5. And there are implications from that statement, which I will leave you to ponder, but I'm happy to talk about in the next, in the questions and discussion. But I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. More educative and provocative answers. My next speaker is Andrei Yeliseyeu, who is Belarusian, and he works for the Belarusian Institute for Security Studies, a very well noted and very independent institution working in Minsk, which I have consulted digitally many times, and I am very thankful for his presence here. Andrei.
Thank you. I believe at least once in a lifetime, every one of us has faced an uncomfortable situation when one gets an invitation he or she dislikes, but cannot decline it and has to accept it. And now I'm not talking about my participation in this conference, which is a big pleasure for me, but about Russia's invitation to Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Armenia to take part in its Eurasian integration project.
That was the best starting joke.
So, on the one hand, given a high level of economic dependence and political dependence of the ruling elites on Russia, the countries couldn't just decline the invitation. But on the other hand, such experienced autocrats as Lukashenko and Nazarbayev, they do not have a slightest intention to share their political power with any supranational institutions. So what did the countries have to do in this situation? They tried to limit the depth of the integration. So what we've been seeing for the last 3 years, numerous contacts between Lukashenko and Nazarbayev, which concerted their actions and statements while drafting the treaty on the Eurasian Economic Union. And what do we see in the end? In the treaty, there's no mention on the political aspect of integration. Only the treaty says it is a regional economic project with the name of aims of establishing 4 freedoms and coordination of policies in a number of economic sectors. So from the technical side, this treaty resembles the Rome Treaty of 1957 of the European Economic Community, which came with the same aims and had also transitional periods, just as the Eurasian integration project does. while acknowledging that this is a Russia-led integration project, it is nevertheless erroneous to say that Russia dictates all the norms within this project. Take, for example, the common external tariff. When the customs union between Belarus, Russia, and Kazakhstan was established, then many suggested that Russia dictated common external tariff rates. In reality, the reality is more complex. There was a recent comprehensive study under the aegis of the European University in Florence, which showed that, in fact, there was a compromise between national regimes. And taken into account, Russia is a larger market. Even without any power abuse, Russia theoretically had a larger impact on setting the common external tariffs, but nevertheless, Russia in reality had less impact than GDP-weighted bargaining would suggest. So, in other words, Russia was ready to have compromises and was ready to agree with its partners to translate the national protection of the key industries in Belarus and Kazakhstan into common rules. Take also the decision-making in the Eurasian Economic Union. So it has a three-tier hierarchy with the Superior Council, the Intergovernmental Council, and the Commission. And what we see that decisions in the Superior Council and Intergovernmental Councils are taken by consensus, and the national proportion in the Commission is equal. So again, one cannot just say that Russia, dictates all the rules within the Eurasian Economic Union, although of course it dominates so much economically. So in reality, it has large leverage over its partners. Now let me briefly present main benefits and economic expenses for Belarus to take part in this integration project. It is, of course, a wide and complex topic, but I'll just mention the most important points. Well, the most important benefit that Belarus sought to get in the Union was more preferential terms on exporting, refining and exporting Russian crude oil. Although Belarus is not an oil-rich country, the structure of its budget revenues resembles so much the structure of an oil-exporting country. In fact, Belarus is an oil offshore. It buys, it has duty-free Russian crude oil, refines it at two fairly well-modernized refineries, and sells oil products, which is the most important source of revenues. Earlier, Belarus, the agreement between the country was that Belarus has has a duty-free Russian oil on an agreed quota. Then it refines and sells the oil products to the West and to Ukraine as well, but had to return the export duties on these oil products to Russian budget. So Lukashenko's main intention was to keep these export duties in the Belarusian budget, and the sum, the whole amount was dependent from year to year between $3 and $3.5 billion, which is quite much for Belarusian economy. And Lukashenko even a couple of years ago said that he would build another Arab Emirates in Belarus had Belarus kept these export duties. In the end, Belarus succeeded in getting this concession from Russia. It was a, so to say, two-round special operation. First, on the eve of signing the treaty on the Eurasian Economic Union in April 2014, and when Russia agreed to that Belarus keep half of the export duties in its own budget. And then on the eve of the ratification of the treaty, Russia finally agreed to that Belarus keep the whole amount of export duties in its budget. However, the creation of the Arab Emirates in Belarus has been delayed, so to say, because the oil prices dropped, and the margin decreased for Belarusian refineries. And the second reason is tax reform in Russia, so-called tax maneuver, and which increased the internal prices for oil for Belarusian refineries. So in the end, Belarus got the concession, but not as much amount of money as it expected. Another economic benefit that Belarus was willing to get is free and unimpeded access of its goods to Russian market. Although there were no customs points on the joint border since late 90s, and Belarus had quite open access for the lion's share of its industry and agricultural products were sold to Russia. Nevertheless, non-tariff barriers existed, and still they do. There was recently the Belarusian Prime Minister stated there are about 350 exemptions from the free trade in commodities between the countries. There was a recent comprehensive study of the Eurasian Development Bank on an impact of non-tariff barriers in the trade between the Eurasian partners. It turned out that there was a survey among more than 500 enterprises, exporters in Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russia. And in overall, the Belarusian exporters assessed the non-tariff barriers at 15% of the overall exports to Russia and Kazakhstan. If we take, for example, not trade in commodities but services, then for example, Russian, Belarusian transportation companies assessed that if non-tariff barriers in the road freight transportation sector were removed, then the freight traffic would double in 3 years, and the vehicle fleet would expand 30% a year. So we can see that there's still a niche to eliminate the existing barriers in trade, in commodities, services. Now about economic expenses, as I already said, Belarus didn't get as much as it expected to from the oil deal with Russia. Also, when Russia became a member of the World Trade Organization, then in 2011 there was signed the treaty on the functioning of the customs union in the framework of the world trade system, something like this. So this agreement, under this agreement, Belarus, being not a member of the WTO, had de facto to accept its rules, and Belarusian exporters started facing more competition on the Russian market, especially in such sectors as agricultural machinery or construction materials, and even more pressure on Belarusian exporters was because of the recent devaluation of the Russian ruble. Well, the Eurasian Economic Union, all in all, cuts most of the because most of the benefits proposed by the by the Eastern Partnership Initiative. And the only carrot that is left for Belarus in the framework of the Eastern Partnership is visa liberalization. Although Belarus doesn't have even a visa facilitation agreement yet. So this is a long story, and as the recent survey of the experts in migration showed, no one seriously expects the visa regime between Belarus and the EU to be abolished not earlier than 7 years. Now, some brief questions, maybe rhetorical questions about challenges that the Eurasian Economic Union brings to Belarus. First, of course, is how successful will the modernization be for Belarus, taking into account that Russia lags behind the European Union in technological advancement. Second, unlike the EU, the Eurasian Economic Union is, at least so far, only about economic reforms, not about political liberalization. And we know that sustainable long-term economic development is not possible without open political institutions. Third, cultural diversity, by the way, is really important for Belarus, which is protected in the European Union, and especially taking into account that Belarus now is even more pegged to Russia institutionally, and taking into account that Belarusian language and culture have been intentionally driven out of the public life. This situation will likely aggravate being a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. And finally, the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty, which are protected in the European Union and neglected by Russia towards the countries who choose European way of development. We can see these problems Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, all of them have. So the sensitive rhetorical question is, given the high level of dependence of Belarus, will Belarus ever be capable of withdrawing from the economic union if it wishes, and what consequences will it bring to Belarus? Okay, let me stop at this pessimistic note. Thanks.
These were not pessimistic notes, these were just questions. And it is not only your job to answer them. Our next speaker is Richard Giragosian. He is the director and the founding director at that of the Regional Studies Center in Yerevan, and has many other capacities and very rich professional past. And he will be giving us a Armenian perspective, or his own.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. One advantage about being the last speaker is that much of the smarter people ahead of me have already said a lot of the background. So therefore, I'd like to limit myself to 3 concise areas. First, looking at the question of today's panel, the Eurasian Union, in terms of arrival and a rising power at that. Secondly, I'll look at the specific case study of Armenia in particular. And third, in conclusion, looking at 3 specific trends that are new. But one observation to begin with. In many ways, what we see in terms of the Eastern Partnership, in many ways, to be general about it, Russia made an offer that Armenia couldn't refuse. The EU made an offer that wasn't understood. And in many ways, this was the dilemma in terms of lessons learned and lessons lost. But let me begin with looking at the Eurasian Union, and I actually share much of the skepticism that was reiterated earlier in terms of the question of the panel, whether it's a rival on the rise. I would argue the Eurasian Union is not a rival and is certainly not rising for 5 specific reasons. First, in many ways, the Eurasian Union is not a rival, but it's a response to European Union engagement. And it's a response from Moscow to push out and to push back against European Union engagement in the so-called near abroad, the post-Soviet space, what Putin sees, defines, and defends as his own sphere of influence. The second reason I'm skeptical is that the Eurasian Union doesn't have the capacity to rival the European Union. Inherently, it's flawed because it's based on a premise of pressure and coercion. The European Union model, whatever criticism we may raise, is still based on a model of attraction, even seduction, not coercion and pressure. In many ways, what the Eurasian Union offers is not free trade, but literally unfree trade, forced trade. The third reason for my skepticism is there's little attraction of the Eurasian Union. Think about the battle of minds, of hearts and minds. What are the European ideals? What are the Eurasian Union ideals? Corruption? A lack of good governance? Authoritarianism? It's not exactly an embracing, heartwarming attraction. God bless you. What we also see, in many ways, the Eurasian Union is based on the wrong rule set. It's a return to a Gosplan style, centralized economy, command economy, which is the inherent opposite of market-based free trade. Fourth, the Eurasian Union remains much too Moscow-centric. This is a Putin project. In many ways, it's a Putin prison in terms of the Armenian perspective. What we also see is Russia has done very well at losing friends and gaining enemies. It may have gained Crimea for the foreseeable future, but has lost Ukraine forever. And most interestingly, the Eurasian Union without Ukraine is much less viable and much less attractive. But having said that, from an Armenian perspective, the real vindication, how we are able to survive the Eurasian Union prison, is to actually enjoy and benefit from, believe it or not, Belarus and Kazakhstan, who are doing a hell of a job in pushing back against Putin, in putting up more of a fight to defend their own sovereignty and independence against Putin's measures within the Eurasian Union. As my colleague has noted, it's the trade war within and among the founding members of the Eurasian Union that stands as stark evidence of its limitation. Moreover, I would argue that the viability, the attractiveness, the utility of the Eurasian Union, even for Putin, is much less. Not only with the loss of Ukraine, but because Putin in general favors bilateral coercion directed against the Eastern Partnership states, doesn't hide behind a multilateral venue, doesn't use the Collective Security Treaty Organization, but it's a bilateral emphasis. The same would apply in terms of a limit to the utility of the Eurasian Union. What's ironic as well is the Eurasian Union may be Putin's project, but it was never Putin's idea. This was a Kazakh proposal. And to this day, President Nazarbayev, the president for life, by the way, always regrets and is immensely frustrated that his pet project was hijacked by Vladimir Putin. And the fifth and final of many reasons why I'm skeptical of the Eurasian Union is that, again, it makes little economic sense. In many ways, it is an integration model in the wrong direction. It's creating Fortress Eurasia. It's isolation, inward-directed integration. It's to keep members locked in, not trade without. And in many ways, it is based on isolation over engagement. And if we look at the tariff structure, the trade direction, it's back to the future. It's resurrecting the Commonwealth of Independent States when it was first unveiled. From an American perspective, this is neither the first nor the last time we'll hear of such a Eurasian integration model. Therefore, my recommendation, because what's most important, especially having the honor to work with the Latvian presidency, is concrete, clear recommendations. My first in this area would be to argue against EU engagement with the Eurasian Union at this point. Because EU engagement with the Eurasian Union now would only legitimize the Eurasian Union. It would only resuscitate what is not working in the Eurasian Union. And EU engagement would be dangerous for actually strengthening the Eurasian Union. Think of it in medical terms. Do no harm should apply in Brussels and the Commission, and do no harm to those of us either in the prison of the Eurasian Union or threatened by it. Now, my second point looks at the case of Armenia. What's interesting is in September 2013, a sudden, abrupt, unilateral decision by the Armenian president was made to sacrifice 3.5 years of negotiations over an association agreement. We all bought our airline tickets to the Vilnius summit. We were pleased and expecting Armenia to initial an association agreement at the Vilnius summit. In September 2013, those hopes were dashed. What was interesting, though, is for 3.5 years, Armenia was briefing Russia every step of the way. Russia never opposed negotiations over the association agreement. My point is, there was a U-turn in policy, but it occurred in Moscow before Armenia. There was a belated Russian decision to draw a line in the sand against the association agreements, but very belatedly. It was a very late decision because, in my assessment, Russia underestimated the European Union and underestimated the ability of the Eastern Partnership countries to fulfill expectations of Brussels and Commissioner Füle at the time. In other words, there was a sudden and dramatic change in Moscow, which very belatedly saw EU engagement on a comparable scale and threat as NATO enlargement, which it wasn't, yes, but the perception was. What's also important, looking at Armenia, Armenia faces 3 distinct challenges. Not from Turkey, not from Azerbaijan, it's from isolation. It's from a threat of insignificance, where no one cares about Armenia except Kim Kardashian. A third threat beyond isolation and insignificance is, of course, the overdependence on Russia, structurally, mortgaging sovereignty and independence in the name of security. And in fact, that is the Armenian government's excuse or justification for joining the Eurasian Union and sacrificing the association agreement. I would argue it's not about security. It's about insecurity. In fact, Armenia is now less secure than it was prior to joining the Eurasian Union. At the same time, the other danger for Armenia, given post-Crimea and Ukraine, is the danger of being on the wrong side of history, of being trapped behind what seems to be a new Iron Curtain that Putin seems intent on constructing. Moreover, if we look at lessons learned and lessons lost, the first lesson learned applies to us, civil society in Armenia, generally pro-European, pro-Western. Our lesson learned was we were lazy and complacent. We didn't see this coming. We thought after 3.5 years, it was a done deal. We didn't see Russia's pressure and coercion coming in time. The second lesson learned was for Brussels. With all due respect to the European Union, there was a significant mistake in terms of the lack of a clear and coherent communication strategy. Not enough was invested in articulating, in defining and defending what is the association agreement and the DCFTA. What are the benefits for the ordinary citizen, the ordinary consumer? If the expert community didn't understand, how could the ordinary population be expected to? What this also meant is a weak marginal constituency for the association agreement. This is important in terms of building more constituency for an association agreement. And a lesson lost. Beyond a lesson learned of communications and constituency was the lack of trust and confidence. The immediate effect of Armenia's U-turn was not just sacrificing an association agreement, but it was a loss of confidence and trust, which we still have to regain in Brussels. And it was a question of capacity, where another mistake by the European Union was to empower a government with too little in terms of accountability or conditionality. 3.5 years, the EU did a great job in building capacity of the Armenian government to then turn around and sign a deal with Putin, not with Brussels. That wasn't money well spent, in my opinion. If there's a policy of more for more, there should be a policy of less for less. Bad behavior should not be tolerated. We're not juveniles. We've passed 2 decades of independence. The excuse of infant democracies should no longer be so readily accepted. Now the good news. Armenia today is intent on salvaging a relationship with the European Union. It's a second chance, reflecting a degree of political will and sincerity in both Brussels and in Armenia, much to each side's credit. There is an opportunity not to have an association agreement again, but to have a new legal framework, defining and deepening relations. What the EU needs to do, however, is to reward reformers within the Armenian government, and perhaps more importantly, empower, embrace, and enable civil society in terms of accountability, in terms of monitoring implementation, which is harder than actually signing, as we see in Moldova and Georgia. At the same time, what we see is a new opportunity to save the Eastern Partnership, which has now become 2 different camps, 2 tiers. Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine are in the varsity A team. Armenia, with Azerbaijan and Belarus, no offense, it's not exactly the most appealing mix of Eastern Partnership countries. It's the lower tier. Now, in conclusion, I think it's most important to say that there is no conclusion. This is a very dynamic, not static process. It is only beginning. The Riga summit is a starting point, not an end state. But there are 3 trends to note. First, most importantly in Armenia, is that although Armenia remains firmly pro-Russian, it's much less pro-Putin. And this is a trend that has developed since the beginning of the year, challenging the asymmetry of the Armenian-Russian relations, not questioning the relationship, but putting up a fight over the lack of respect and the lack of terms of equity in the relationship. Moreover, the recommendation there for the EU is to also invest in more soft power, to do a better job to defend European ideals and to define what European ideals really are and what they are not. Secondly, in terms of a positive trend, is Armenia-Turkey, which has the promise of being the one positive game changer in the region. In August 2008 in Georgia, the geopolitical map was altered in a very negative sense. Armenian-Turkish normalization has the promise and potential to remake the map, open borders, and change it in a very positive way. What the EU needs to do is to support this effort and further develop its neighbors of neighbors policy, where it's not only about Russia, it's about Iran's engagement, it's about Turkey as well. And third, my final trend is a warning to many EU decision makers, and that's the warning of a war by accident that's approaching very quickly over Nagorno-Karabakh. It's much less a question of if, much more a question of when. War by accident, where both sides stumble into a war that perhaps neither side wants. And this is going to be a flashpoint. Nagorno-Karabakh, even more than Ukraine, is a war that could draw in Turkey, Russia, and Iran very quickly. At the same time, the recommendation is for the EU to not only pay more attention and devote greater scrutiny, but also invest in deterrence and containment. Not just leave it to 3 OSCE mediators who are great at getting frequent flyer miles, but are unable to achieve much in the absence of political will. And the reason I bring this warning up is because for the past 4 months, we've begun to measure the ceasefire violations not by bullets fired, but in bodies and casualties. And that's also why, in many ways, it's ironic. It's because of Nagorno-Karabakh that Armenia and Hungary do not have diplomatic relations today. They were broken off several years ago. It's not only Armenia-Turkey that we need to normalize relations, but we also need to restore diplomatic relations between Budapest and Yerevan. Thank you.
Well, I proudly would like to think that this quality, the quality of this panel did match the previous one. Both were wonderful. Before questions from the audience, I would like to raise one issue, and perhaps one volunteer from the panel could address that, nearer to quality of democracy, human rights issues. What was not mentioned, domestic political reasons, enticement and interests of Belarus and Armenia, those countries that have joined the Eurasian Union. Was it, is there also a kind of interest in maintaining illiberal democracy, autocracy? Is there an interest in preventing color revolutions to happen? Is it a powerful factor?
Let me start with Armenia in that case. Yes, in many ways, the domestic political context was a key driver in Armenia's insecurity, vulnerability. One observation for all of our countries, including Central and Eastern Europe, is one underestimated aspect is that as interesting, as sexy as geopolitics could be, it's really about local economics and politics. That's the key to managing risk and vulnerability to external pressure. And far too little attention within the Eastern Partnership is devoted to that inherent internal vulnerability. For the Armenian context, what's also important is, for the very same reasons that the lack of democracy, the domestic political context was a key driver in having the Armenian president give up and give in far too quickly, is also grounds for optimism. Because the Armenian president, even though there's a camera in the room, the Armenian president is the last of the Mohicans, the last of a specific political elite that came to power from Nagorno-Karabakh and that came to power because of the conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh. The transition is starting. The political transition is important for two reasons. Not because a new generation or a new political elite will automatically be better or democratic. But the fact that the transition is forcing open a closed political and economic system, creating a more level playing field, where the Armenian government won't be able to even afford to buy the next election. It's not the lack of legitimacy politically, it's the economics of the state weakness that matter most. And that's why the domestic political context, given not just a weak, unpopular government, but a discredited, old, ineffective opposition, creates also an arena for the emergence of a new opposition, which is also coming. So for these very same reasons, I'm optimistic.
Yes, please.
Just to answer your question, Miklós, and very simply, very briefly, when the the Eastern Partnership makes demands of its governments which would fundamentally undermine those regimes, particularly those in Azerbaijan, Belarus, and Armenia as well, in fact. And so it is, in fact, not in the leadership's interests, in some ways, to be part of the Eastern Partnership. They are indeed more akin. They are closer politically to the ideals of the Eurasian Union, such as it is, than they are to the ideals of the Eastern Partnership. It's a big logic loophole in the Eastern Partnership, and it begs a question for the next panel, perhaps, rather than for this panel, that perhaps the Eastern Partnership would be better off expelling those three countries. This is a controversial point, but nonetheless one I will make. But expelling those three countries on the basis that they have no interest in the reforms that the Eastern Partnership requires of them, because it would fundamentally undermine the regimes, and it's all about maintenance of a regime. So I agree.
Yes, Lolita, please.
Yes, I think this was a very good point that James made, and basically it is indeed so that signing association agreement and implementing all the many pieces of legislation basically defines the country on the road of subjecting itself to the so-called creative destruction. You do not know where you will end. And I think that this is exactly what is happening in Ukraine, and there are, of course, some encouraging signs and some discouraging signs. But I think that the previous speaker in the panel, Mr. Shulga, very well pointed that out, that the situation in Ukraine has actually created a political nation that is open to the forces of creative destruction. And of course, it is endangering the regimes that want to hold on to power by, as we know in Armenia, fraudulent elections.
That three of you answered my question makes it imperative for me to ask Andrei the question in a different form. Can Belarus's participation in the Union, in the Eurasian Union, be perceived as an actually reversed Marshall Plan, just as the original Marshall Plan was to uphold a certain form of democracy, liberal democracy, namely, is the participation of Belarus in the Eurasian Union necessary for at least Mr. Lukashenko, given the fact that otherwise, without Russian help, the regime, the system may be not sustainable?
Of course, for Lukashenko, it's a matter of his political longevity, and it is not just about economic modernization, but political support from Russia. Of course, he couldn't just decline the invitation and put under the risk his political longevity. But I'd like to put forward a couple of figures on national polls. Say when asking if people support the Eurasian integration, then about more than 60% of Belarusians say affirmative. But when asked to choose between the membership in the European Union and close integration with Russia, then figures are more or less equal. Nowadays Russian vector is more popular, but say 2 years ago the figures were like 40% to 40% and 20% indecisive, which is even more funny that a few percent of the population choose both membership in the EU and closer cooperation with Russia. And as far as I know, if the data of the Eurobarometer made by the Eurasian Development Bank is true, then the same tendency is in Armenia, when a couple of percent of Armenians as well choose both to have a closer integration with the EU and Russia. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and Andrei has to be taken very seriously because his institution is the originator of those polls, and the whole international community must very much rely on their data. Thank you so much. If the panel agrees, they would have to compose their final words in answering the question from the audience. You raise your hand first, and then let's go first 3 rows, and then the last 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Julian Lindley, French. Let me challenge your assumptions. I'm sitting in, say, North America, and I know nothing about the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union. It would be very easy to look at both of them and say they're both systems of protection and power projection. That the EU is as much about power in these various ways as the Eurasian Union. We talked about transparency. Well, the EU is not great on transparency. We talked about no coercion. Brussels is, having spent many years in Brussels, not great on handling dissent. We talked about free trade. Just mentioned the Services Directive and where that's gone in the single market. And we talk about competition. Well, the EU is not exactly the most hyper-competitive open trading bloc in the world. I fully buy the idea that the EU is not the Eurasian Economic Union and nothing like it. But I warn against the complacency that we're the white knights and they're the black knights. Because there is a perception issue here that we could be in danger of being complacent with our own chauvinism. And I'd be curious as to your response to that danger.
Let's collect questions. So you, please. No, the gentleman in the second.
Thank you, Dénes Nagy, International Circle of Hungary. Although I understand that the panel would not agree, let us suppose that the Eurasian Union is here to stay and that it becomes a political union. And considering the great abundance of common threats, ISIS and international terrorism, just to name 2, would it not be in the interest of the European Union to treat the Eurasian Union as an equal partner, whilst at the same time, of course, voicing our concerns with regards to good governance, the rule of law, and of course trade standards? Because Mr. Nixey said that negotiation with Russia is futile because they view us as a hegemonic power. Well, if we treat them as equals, they shall not, by definition. So would that not help dispel, disperse this notion then?
Thank you. The gentleman in the second row.
My name is Armenian Grigorian. So I have some questions, comments, maybe. So, Lolita, Čigāne, you mentioned that EU is a stillborn child. Yes, economically I would agree, but politically, perhaps the main reason is politics for creating it, because very recently, a few days ago, Mr. Putin stopped pretending about something and said openly that the Soviet Union was just another name for the Russian Empire, so those lands are Russian lands, essentially. And in this respect, maybe creation of the Eurasian Union was more meaningful. And Armenia's membership particularly has already become an additional tool for pressure on Georgia concerning demands for transit rights formally to Armenia, which doesn't share a border with any union member, but in fact they're more interested in supplying their military base, and even Russian analysts don't make a secret about that. And By the way, Armenia's export to Russia declined more than 90% since January, when Armenia joined the Eurasian Union. Although they were saying that, okay, opening all the markets would be beneficial. We had open markets for years within the CIS framework. But people tend to forget about that under the influence of some propaganda. While exports to the EU, China, and Japan has grown since January, actually. Not largely, but still. And concerning Riga summit, Richard, well, I'm also a bit optimistic, but on the other side, I remember Konstantin Kosachev's statements about 6 weeks ago about NGOs working towards European integration, and again, repeated threats about if you don't come closer to Russia, you may share Ukraine's fate. And such threats started before September 2013, but the most notorious one was last year in February when Dugin said that in an interview, and just 6 days before invasion to Crimea. And he also said in that interview that Russia would move troops into Crimea. So could you elaborate a little bit on this?
If you don't mind, the gentleman from the Russian Federation has a very good cue now to answer these three statements.
Probably I first would like also to share my impression about the session. So I can say that it was excellent in terms of to make anti-propaganda of custom union and Eurasian economic union. But if we judge the session from the point of view, the knowledge of substance, the knowledge of Eurasian economic integration, to me, unfortunately, it is unsatisfactory, and we are in the university, and we can suggest they have excellent speakers. By the way, it is one of the main European integration organization about the question is whether it is a stillborn child. I can just one thing, that Vietnam is going to sign in May, probably during this week or next week, a free trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union. And you see, and then there is also a good question, what, yes, and then one important thing to underline, why this integration is successful. And I have read once in the Chatham House papers that it was the most successful integration in post-former Soviet Union area. It is because due to the pure fact that we use the same model as European Union. It is the same, and nothing. You know that and this is the reason for the success. And the experts from European Commission and from China spent a lot of time for this so-called useless organization without economic substance to discuss with them the technical norms and regulations which they will adopt and will affect trade with Eurasian Economic Union. And it is up to you, up to European Union. Do you want to have integration? Do you have to have dialogue? Chancellor Merkel was in favor of this, but probably not everybody. But we have a lot of other partners throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you for your remark. Bono, please react as briefly as you can, so we can have more questions. Please start with this.
First, on Julian's observation about the potential of complacency, I believe that this is an extremely appropriate observation, because indeed there is sometimes a wish to be inward-looking in the European Union too, to be complacent and to actually build Fortress Europe. And just to say, well, we have enough of our problems, you deal with yours, we'll just be inward-looking. And this is very dangerous because obviously there is no such thing as Fortress Europe, because obviously the borders are as they are, and it's the European Union is constantly impacted on both what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in the West Balkans, North Africa, just to mention a few places. So for that reason, our presidency, as one of the priorities, has globally engaged Europe, and we are also focusing on Central Asia. And we try to be very helpful for the High Representative Mogherini to actually elaborate a new Central Asian strategy, which is really needed. The EU has to be noticing regions, places, and also their individualistic characters around them. So this is a very brief response to this. If we talk about Russia, treating Russia as equal partner, I unfortunately have to say that I believe that we have far progressed beyond that stage where we can start from scratch or tabula rasa, basically. There have been certain actions that have been undertaken by Russia that prevents us from doing that. Occupation of Crimea, aggression in southern eastern part of Ukraine, constant provoking of Scandinavian countries, visits to Norwegian archipelago recently, submarines close to the Scandinavian borders, planes without transponders, propaganda channels, massive media propaganda that is undertaken. We cannot consider this to be an equal partner to discuss with. Unfortunately, I would very much want to have a constructive dialogue with Russia if it was possible. And the last point, on my point about stillborn child, and saying that economically is not, but politically probably there is a viability. I still do not believe that, because there is a fact of coercion. And probably it was my observation, but it was conferred by colleagues from the Armenian and Belarusian side. So in the situation of coercion or of a feeling that someone has been forced into this marriage, so to say, I believe that the political viability is also highly disputed.
Thank you. Andrei?
I'd like to say that free trade agreement with Vietnam is not a good indicator of success of the Eurasian Economic Union. First, I highly doubt that it's going to be a comprehensive free trade agreement, because it will shut down textile industries in the EU countries. Second, the free trade agreements were announced with a dozen of countries, Turkey, Egypt, to name a few. And by the way, the first negotiations on the free trade agreement were started with New Zealand. And most of the negotiations either stuck or they never started. Say New Zealand expected to have a free trade agreement with the customs union and to export its dairy products. And as far as I know, Belarus was, against it not to put under the risk its exports of dairy products to Russia. So I think this is, in fact, not a good indicator of the success of the union. Thanks.
Thank you.
Right. Julian, isn't EU a power projection organisation, poor at competition? There is a very good job going at Russia today, I understand, Julian, if you'd like to apply. Because, of course, absolutely. These are, of course, the arguments, and I know you don't mean to do this, and I'm being facetious, but you're being agitprop, exactly. These are the arguments that Russia makes. I mean, Vladimir Putin is very adept at making these comparisons. Free press, lack of free press, well, don't you have Rupert Murdoch? What are we doing in Chechnya? Oh, what have you done in Northern Ireland? There is, in the past. Vladimir Putin is an expert at using historical context to justify his own maneuvers and manipulations. And so, obviously, I mean, I don't mean to be, just to be serious, then you're absolutely right. I would caution Eastern Partnership countries about having an over-faith in the EU, because it's let you down before, you 6 Eastern Partnership countries, and it will probably let you down again. The only way of doing this is not to rely on the EU as a white knight in shining armour, but to play the ball, not the man, and to ultimately sort out your own systems and then force the EU into recognising you rather than and rather than giving the EU the excuse not to have to deal with you. That's the only way forward, because the EU is not to be relied upon, and it hasn't put the resources, effort, political will, money behind its words. Treating the Eurasian Economic Union as an equal partner. Look, apart from these, I mean, it's two answers together, really. Is it Dima from Hungary, Dinos, and you, sir, from a Russian embassy. But I'm afraid I would treat them as an equal partner if they were equal. But there is no analogousness to it whatsoever through everything that we have just said. But quite simply, we just don't want the same things. Our values are different. Yes, I understand we should have common priorities with what is it you mentioned, piracy or no ISIS, I think you said. And you're right in theory, but in practice, what is Russia doing? It's selling S-300s back to Iran again, or it just every maneuver it makes is designed to keep the Americans out and to keep the Russians in the game. And that's not a convenient or acceptable partner for an organization which, Julian, to be fair, to go back to you, for all its faults, of which there are so many, does do quite a good job at using rules and regulations like it is on the Gazprom issue right now, and preventing Russia's monopoly there. Very briefly, at the, well, I'll leave it there. I've gone on too long, so I'll stop. Sorry.
Let me jump in then, sorry. One key observation here is, let's also put this into a realistic context, in that the European Union is not the answer. It's not the panacea. It's not the magic solution to all our problems. But it is an important tool for our countries. And it's a vision, a strategic vision. And the EU, unlike nearly all other such models, it's only the EU that has a line of countries waiting to join and wanting to join. This is a key difference. But on the other hand, let me also add, let's look at Putin. Putin, if the EU is not our answer for everything, Putin is not to blame for all of our problems and our policy mistakes either. He's become too convenient to blame all of our shortcomings and deficiencies. Oh, it's Putin's fault. And that's a mistake even in Kiev. Although in defense of Ukraine, I do want to add, words are very important. And I get frustrated at too many people in Brussels and Washington who like the words crisis and conflict, but shy away from using the word war. People are dying in Ukraine. Let's not insult our own intelligence. Words are important. But again, the EU may not be the magic bullet to all of our problems, nor is Putin, the mighty me or the evil genius, the Dr. No of the world. In many ways, we have to share our own burden of responsibility for our own mistakes and shortcomings.
Thank you. I think you should be happy with the word conflict if you hear the word challenge, which is even lowercase. Okay, first question there, and second, and third. Thank you. And fourth. Let's, as usual with conferences, we are just starting to be behind the schedule. So please keep it very short, especially if these are comments, which are welcome otherwise.
And we'll give short answers, too, in return.
Yeah.
I'll try.
I'm Ákos István Postal journalist, and I would have some short remarks. Once there was the question of some people thought that they can be in the same time pro-EU and pro-Eurasian Union. There is even an MEP from Hungary, Kovács Béla, who stated in a press conference that he would propose that Hungary, as an EU member state, should be in the same time in the Eurasian Union. So there are even such ideas within the European Parliament. Also, what is interesting in this question, within the European Parliament, there are in several European parties politicians who are telling that Russia should be also part of the European Union, like Angelika Mlinar, the Austrian MEP, also other high-level person.
What's wrong with pluralism?
So that's quite interesting point. But in the same time, it's also an interesting question that if Juncker tells that within the next 5-10 years there will be no new EU member states taken, then what can Johannes Hahn do? Just drink some coffee with Lukashenko or Leanka or the other Eastern members, Eastern Partnership states, and then just drinking coffee and talking and doing nothing, because Juncker stated that there will be no adhesion neither from the Balkans nor from the post-Soviet region. That's a big question, because if Putin tells we can make a stronger cooperation immediately, and Juncker tells, oh, we want you, but a bit later, then it's also quite huge problem what were also stated there, that those are problems in the communication and also in the adhesion by the European Union. So I would also question what are your opinion on it? Yeah, so that was the remark. And
thank you. Make it please as brief as possible. Thank you.
Молодикова Irina, Central European University. Now we discuss, should European Union cooperate with Russia or with the Eurasian Center? 1 week ago, almost, it was discussion here, the same session about Russia, and they talk about cold peace and about that it should be some cooperation. In this context, I wanted to ask, unfortunately, our Ukrainian and Moldovan colleagues now not here, the issue of visa regime. As you know, still no solution for some countries of European partnership, but from the other hand, from the 1st of January, Russia introduced new migration policy. And of course, in this context, the countries that included to Eurasian Union have people that have preferences. And as we know, majority of former Soviet Union countries sent to Russia, not to European Union, their labor migrant. What to do in this context? Because if these countries will not find solution, I mean, still even Moldova, it can be problem with labor market and with deterioration of situation. The same in Ukraine now already. Central Asia even worse, because now new policy with Tajikistan, Uzbekistan created floor militants to the Islamic State to fight, just like labor forces. And European Union should to consider all possible consequences, because we live together in one place. How they propose to respond?
Thank you so much. Who is the next one? Lolita and Čigāne.
Hello. I just had a quick question. My name is Olga. I come from Kazakhstan. I'm studying here at CEU, and I'm planning to pursue my PhD in England. I just wanted to highlight the problematics between, I think, the group of those people who responded to the Andrei Yeliseyeu's poll, right? And not necessarily yours, that some people say, why should we choose EU or the Eurasian Union? We want to choose both, right? And it sounds funny when you think about it in the context of our today's discussions. But in the context of young people, it sounds very realistic in a way that, for example, a lot of people from Kazakhstan studied abroad, thousands of people studied abroad. They come back and they're not happy with Europe. They can't find job in Europe. they can't even get funding to do PhDs in Britain because they're not EU or British citizens. So they come back home and they think maybe we can establish an alternative world where we can actually implement our knowledge and construct a Eurasian Union. And to me, it's very interesting because it's a new generation that is also supporting sort of this direction, right? So they're Western educated. We would expect them to subscribe to the liberal ideas and values, but they do not. They come back and they oppose those ideas. They say that Europe is weird. The LGBTQ rights are weird. You know, all this multiculturalism is weird, right? And of course, for people in Western academia, it sounds like, how can someone criticize liberal ideas? But there are a lot of people in Russia and in Kazakhstan who actually don't support liberal ideas, and they don't even want to join EU. Because obviously, a person from Kazakhstan wouldn't even dream of joining the EU, right? So to me, the question I pose to the panel is, how valid do you see this opposition of the values in a way that it's a non-democratic countries, but if you think there are some elements of democracy. And for example, I work at Nazarbayev University. It's an Nazarbayev University, which is funny. But at the same time, they have a partnership with Cambridge University, where I worked, and we developed educational reforms, and we are still developing them. And it's like this non-democratic regime that is so hard that it tries to reform itself, right? And to me, this poses an interesting question as an alternative to liberal democracy, or can we treat it more seriously in a way that it is here, it will be there, and maybe it's not as bad as we want it to be?
Or could be.
Or could be.
Hopefully not too distant future.
Thank you.
Bernard Horsvezener from CU. Just a really quick question about the Eurasian Union in general. I mean, we tend to see it sometimes as, and I think that's the core explanation, that it is built as opposed to the EU. I think that's probably one of the core reasons. But I think there's something on all these narratives of trying to blame Russia too much, of exerting its power way too much. Because personally, from my perspective, and from Central Asia, which is a region I'm more familiar with, I mean, the Central Asian states vis-a-vis Russia sometimes are just as bad in not obeying the agreements they sign with Russia. And can't the Eurasian Union, at least from this perspective, be seen as a way of at least putting a playing field of negotiations between these countries? At least, these bilateral agreements can be negotiated in a certain kind of forum. And this in itself might be positive, even just the agreements that, for example, Russia signed with Belarus, than the situation that you had perhaps before, where both sides constantly disobeying or disagreeing or coercing each other. So I think Russia has a bad reputation, which is to be expected given its power, but so do all of the other members.
Thank you. Here we turn to the last contributions from the panel, but not without a last question from me, or a hypothesis maybe, because the last two speakers, very, very interesting. They are raising the hope or the specter, it depends from the point of view, of a future it's not mutually exclusive, to be in an open world of the Russian-speaking world, and at the same time benefiting from all the goodies that the European Union is offering. And my question is, somewhat provocative again, isn't the best perspective, given the present quite aggressive state of Russian policy, isn't the hope of all participants, European Union and the Eurasian Union member states, waiting out, keeping up as much value and as much peace and as much cooperation as possible for the post-Putin times?
Yes, I agree. Excellent points. I can just make one point and one reference to a philosopher, British philosopher, who was born in Riga, Yeliseyeu Berlin, and he is supposed to be the founder of the liberal sort. And actually, in one of his essays, he talks about intolerance of liberals. That liberals are so convinced of their cause that they are actually sometimes aggressively fighting and becoming very intolerant themselves. A very interesting essay, an interesting perspective. And I think that we do sometimes see that some of us suffer of that, and sometimes are not inclusive enough, seeing the variations. But of course, there are different paths to democracy, but in a country where people are imprisoned for their political views, that's definitely the line we should not tolerate, no matter how tolerant we want to be. So waiting out for post-Putin time, I'm actually seeing the developments in Russia. I'm afraid that Putin propaganda has unleashed forces that would be probably even more destructive than constructive, and this is my big scare.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yes, Dean.
Can you be pro-EU and pro-Eurasian Union? I can't emphasize this enough, but the two things are completely and utterly incompatible. Not just in their direction and orientation, but in their values and everything that they stand for, but also economically. Quite clearly, you cannot be part of a free trade organization on the one hand and another one on the other side, because it's economically illiterate to believe it so. So much as I would like to say, it's easy to say, oh, cooperation and compatibility, it's just not physically, realistically possible. And then my question for Richard would be, how does Armenia expect to square that circle of restoring relations with the EU when it's made its bed already with the Eurasian Customs Union? But because of something you said at the end. Sorry. Hope you heard that. Olga in Kazakhstan. I couldn't agree with you more. And but I suppose the point is that we shouldn't be looking to. It's perfect. Everything you say is perfectly reasonable, and I have no problem, really, with countries going their own way. And if that is Kazakhstan's sovereign choice to be, shall we say, conservative with a small c, to be relatively illiberal, intolerant towards sexual minorities, for example.
Foreign agents.
Absolutely. Fair enough. What I have an absolute problem with is the coercion of another sovereign state into another integration organization. So I don't expect Kazakhstan to hold our values, although I suspect it will come along in time. It's simply a question of being on the right side of history in the end, because that's the way patterns are shifting over a longer period of time. But I you know, again, if Russia wishes to stop girls from twerking in front of Second World War monuments, fine, or lock up Pussy Riot, or whatever it wants to do, it's okay. What is not okay is disobeying of the rules that Russia has set itself by being in the Council of Europe, and so it's playing with the rules, not playing by the rules. So it's a question of what you've signed up to. And finally, just very briefly, absolutely, the gentleman top left, the Central Asian states are indeed just as bad at holding to their own agreements as the Russians are, and we should hold everybody equally to equal accountability, of course. So Azerbaijan should be held to the same standards as Russia is, and we shouldn't forget that, and we don't, of course. We don't do that, and that is the EU being two-faced, and it makes us look bad, and it's a valid weapon and argument for Russia to use against us.
Thank you so much. Andrei and Richard, respectively, 2 minutes. Thank you very much, because if you can manage.
Yeah, I'd like just to comment on the labor migration thing. Now, as I saw it, we mixed two things: visa regime, visa abolition, and opening labor market. Because when we talk about visa liberalization, it's just we mean the abolition of visas for short-term visas. It's not about opening labor market for migrants to work. So this is what is more important is the struggle between, say, Russia and Poland for persons in productive age from Belarus and Ukraine. Say last year, both Poland and Russia amended their laws on citizenship, and now, say, Poland grants its citizenship to the holders of the pole of the card within 3 years, and Russia amended its law on citizenship, which if a person, a foreigner, has ancestors, had ancestors who used to live in the USSR or Russian Empire, from 1721, right? Then he or she, after the interview with the immigration services, can get Russian citizenship on a short procedure within half a year. So this struggle for to attract foreigners to in the citizenship is more it's like a upgrade to the visa abolition issue, which is yet one step back. Thanks.
And finally, we have an even more interesting panel, so thank you for your interest.